Oh, you finally made it, Sophie. Lying in the hospital bed, Ted, his shoulder immobilized in a cast, only turned his eyes towards me, a look of relief washing over his face. Then, with a slightly impatient tone, he pleaded, "Please, wipe my body," while I just looked down at him in silence. Considering Ted's penchant for cleanliness, he must be frustrated by not being able to take a bath without the doctor's permission, but I felt no obligation to fulfill such a request. What? And you cheated with my best friend? I snapped coldly, and before I could add anything, the curtain was quickly drawn aside. There stood my best friend, Anne. She exclaimed, "What?" "It isn't me," as she indignantly pointed towards the bed behind her. And there was. "My name is Sophie, a 42-year-old nurse. After graduating from nursing school, I started working at this public hospital, and it's already been 23 years. Promoted to head nurse last year, I've been juggling a myriad of tasks. From organizing study sessions for eager staff to ensuring we provide a comforting environment for our patients. Naturally, my personal life often takes a back seat, with rare days off spent catching up on household chores and rest. Seeing me like this, my best friend and would say, "Seriously, what's with that lifestyle? There's being laid back. And then there's just letting yourself go." Urging me to visit the hair salon more often and to not neglect my skincare as if I were still a pimple-faced teenager. But recently, she's been quieter, leaving me feeling a mix of relief and a touch of sadness. Then, surprisingly, on a day off, Anne invited me to a mixer. Like me, Anne is single, having got married once in her early 20s. After her husband's infidelity led to a tumultuous split, initially, Anne would laugh it off, saying, "That's it for marriage. I wouldn't mind dating again, but one marriage and one divorce are quite enough for me." But lately, she seemed inspired by a senior colleague at work, a role model in life, who had just had a whirlwind later-in-life wedding and seemed blissfully happy. Maybe marriage isn't so bad after all. I'm not getting any younger. And I've learned to navigate the tough times, but it does get lonely not having someone to share the good times with, she mused, becoming more keen on attending mixers. When she suggested going to a mixer, I hesitated, saying, "Mixers, huh? Well, you always look great and young for your age. So it might be fine for you, but I feel like an old lady already. Maybe I'll pass." But she persisted, assuring me, "Don't worry. The mixers I go to are always well balanced in terms of age groups." Feeling a bit guilty for always saying no, I decided to join her just this once, thinking it would satisfy Anne. And that's where I met Ted, my fiancé. Ted, a colleague of Anne's, is 6 years my senior at 48. Despite his desire for marriage, his engaging career always took precedence. I don't regret my choice, but the thought of having a partner to share life's laughs with is quite appealing, he said with a wistful smile, which naturally led to us exchanging contacts. After a year of dinners, drinks, and drives, Ted proposed. And I, feeling a future with him might be pleasant, happily accepted. When it came time to meet each other's parents, Ted's lived just a short distance away. Ted's mother, Kate, upon realizing I was over 40, couldn't hide her disappointment. Moreover, upon asking about my alma mater and current job, she commented to Ted's father, Mike, standing next to her. A younger bride might have brought hopes of grandkids, but a nurse? I suppose that's barely passing. While Kate was speaking, Mike looked at her with a face as if he had bitten into a bitter bug, leading me to expect he might scold her, saying, "Don't speak so rudely." Instead, he said, "What does barely passing mean? A nurse or whatever, an old maid is an old maid, isn't she?" I glanced at Ted, hoping for some support, but he only offered a sheepish smile, not rebuking his parents. Kate, smugly, continued, "This is where you lack depth of thought, dear. If our daughter-in-law is a nurse, we can take your mother out of her nursing home, and she can take care of her. It saves the cost of the home. And we can get the entrance fee refunded. Plus, with a nurse as a daughter-in-law, it's like having 24/7 care for free." Ted really knows how to pick them, she boasted, convincing Mike, who seemed satisfied suddenly. Then he apologized to Ted, "I see your point now. Sorry for not understanding your intentions sooner. Then, Ted, overly dramatically sniffling next to me, started saying in a teary voice, "As long as you understand, that's all that matters." Which was more chilling than annoying, and I honestly don't remember much about what was discussed or done after that. Still in shock, I got into Ted's car, and as we were heading back, he suddenly said, "So, when shall we visit your parents' house for the greetings? Since we'll be cutting ties after the marriage, this will be the first and last time, so maybe we should book a fancy restaurant or something." Which jolted me back to reality. "You don't need to bother visiting my house," I said coldly. Ted, seemingly oblivious to my tone, cheerfully replied, "Oh, is that so? Well, no need for unnecessary expenses then. I do appreciate your practicality, that's one of the reasons I chose you as my wife," his mood undampened. My frustration reached its peak, but I held back any retorts, asking instead to be dropped off near a station as a headache began to set in. Ted, dismissively, said, "What, a headache? Have you been sick this whole time? Poor self-management is just the worst." And without driving me to the station, he pulled over to let me out, not even looking back as he drove away. While catching a taxi home, I gradually came back to my usual self and began to feel genuinely infuriated, recalling the outrageous comments made by Ted's family. It was the first time I heard about Ted's grandmother living in a nursing home. And the idea that they wanted to skimp on her care costs by making me a free caregiver was appalling. I was angry at myself for not seeing Ted's true nature despite dating him for a year, but fortunately, we hadn't got married officially yet. So calling off the engagement seemed easier than going through a divorce. Soaking in the bath at home, I resolved to act quickly and decided to go to Ted's place the next day to end the marriage talks as if they never happened, before drifting off to sleep. The next day, I apologized for the sudden change but swapped shifts at the hospital and headed to Ted's apartment. Ideally, I should have scheduled an appointment in advance, but at that moment, I was filled with a strong desire to avoid any unnecessary conversation with Ted. Considering it was Saturday, I assumed that if Ted was following his usual weekend schedule, visiting him early in the morning would surely catch him at home. However, despite making my way to Ted's much-bragged-about high-rise apartment, no matter how many times I rang the intercom at his unit from the entrance, there was no response. Left with no choice, I sent a message on social media, but it wasn't even read. The same went for emails and phone calls. Honestly, it was anticlimactic given my momentum, but since I had taken the day off, I decided to settle things once and for all by going to Ted's parents' house. Perhaps he had gone back home and stayed there after our last encounter. Even if Ted wasn't there, a straightforward "I could never be a suitable bride for your family" to his parents would likely suffice to easily call off the engagement. Fortunately, no formal engagement rituals had been performed, and no money had been spent on engagement rings or wedding reservations. Hence, I believed that if we both agreed, calling off the engagement could be smoothly executed. So, I took a taxi to Ted's parents' house, where I had visited just yesterday, but before getting out of the taxi, I spotted Ted's parents, Ted, and a woman with a familiar silhouette all getting into a car. Feeling uneasy, I had the taxi follow their car, which led us to a restaurant's parking lot about 15 minutes from their house. I had the taxi drive past the restaurant and then make a U-turn to come back, after which I got out and headed towards the entrance of the restaurant. Given it was a Saturday morning, the place was reasonably busy with families enjoying breakfast and, possibly due to the proximity to a highway entrance, people setting off on trips. Hiding behind waiting people, I scanned the interior and spotted the group of 4 by a window-side booth. So I asked a staff member to seat me in a booth back-to-back with theirs. Conveniently, some faux greenery pots line the partition, allowing me to hear their conversation without being seen unless I stood up. After placing my order quickly, I eavesdropped to hear Ted's father, in a tone starkly different from his attitude towards me the day before, saying, "Ah, Annie, you are young and obedient. If you eventually becomes Ted's wife, nothing could make me happier. I can't wait for that day." Annie, as in Anne? Realizing this, I was struck by such a shock that it felt like everything went dark before my eyes. My brief glimpse of the young woman from the car window making sense now. It was my best friend, Anne. Anne was dating Ted. They worked at the same company, but since when? Since Ted and I started dating. Or had they been together even before we were introduced at the mixer? But then, why did Ted date me and even propose? My mind was swarming with questions, but I tried hard to focus on the conversation next door. It turned out that Ted and Ann had started dating recently, and marriage discussions were already underway. Moreover, not only was Ted's family aware, but Ann also knew about the ongoing marriage talks between Ted and me. Wondering why they wanted to marry me off to Ted, I began to fear that yesterday's talk of a free, year-round caretaker wasn't just a bad joke. Ted then said, "I really don't want to marry that old hag, but from what I've heard, she's quite wealthy. She'd be perfect for taking care of Grandma until the end. Meanwhile, I can continue seeing Annie on the side." To this, Ted's parents added, "If we have grandchildren by then, we can't blame the kids, so we could just tell her to leave. And we might get away without paying alimony. Actually, if we play our cards right, we might even get some money out of her. And that's a brilliant idea. We could claim she was rough during the care and might get away with it quite easily." They laughed heartily. Hearing this, I barely contained my rising anger towards Ted, his family, and continuing to eavesdrop. Ted and Ann, taking advantage of the upcoming 3-day weekend, were planning to travel to a hiking right after. The hotel, accessible only by car, required them to rent a new 4WD from a rental car shop near the restaurant, instead of using their usual sedan. And it seemed his parents had come to see them off. Fueled by anger, I decided against confronting them there and instead resolved to gather evidence and show them hell later. I discreetly left the restaurant before they did and moved across the street to a convenience store, watching them from behind the window. Soon, Ted's parents left in their car heading home, while Ted and Ann, wearing matching caps and pulling carry-on bags, walked off. Presumably towards the rental car shop I had located about 0.12 miles away on my phone map. Watching their backs with a bitter feeling, I turned away and opened a ride-hailing app. Since I had night shift that day, I focused on my work until Sunday morning. After my shift ended, I planned to get some sleep but checked my phone on the way home to find numerous missed calls and messages. Most from Ted and some from an unknown number. Curiosity piqued, I listened to the voicemail from the unknown caller, who claimed to be an administrative staff from a hospital in the area where Ted and Ann were visiting, saying, "A patient involved in a self-inflicted accident last night has asked to contact you urgently." Shocked yet momentarily feeling vindictive about divine retribution, I was more intrigued about why they contacted me. Hesitant to call Ted's phone directly, I searched for the hospital online, called the main line, and was promptly filled in by the admin who had left the message. After getting the details, I immediately booked a ticket to a station near the hospital for the next day and went to sleep. Departing early the next morning, I arrived smoothly at the hospital. I killed time in a nearby cafe until the hospital's visiting hours on the holiday, then went to see Ted. Directed to a 2-patient room, I found Ted in the bed closer to the door, having his shoulder immobilized in a cast and with his left leg in a cast, too. Noticing me but seemingly in pain when moving, he only turned his eyes towards me and weakly smiled. "Sophie, to come all this way to see me." "Thank you." Trying to elicit my sympathy, but I was well aware of his tricks. As I stood there silently, Ted nervously tried to make conversation, but I gave no response and continued to ignore him. Frustrated, Ted finally blurted out, "Please, wipe my body," gesturing towards a thin towel in a bag on the nearby table, presumably bought from the shop. I glanced briefly at the towel but remained silent, prompting an even more agitated Ted to snap, "Come on, hurry up. What's with you? Just standing there since a while ago?" Approaching his bed, I leaned in and coldly said, "What?" After cheating with my best friend. Before Ted could say anything, the curtain separating the beds was dramatically pulled aside, and Anne exclaimed, "Huh? It isn't me, then," pointing to a woman cowering on the bed behind her. She declared, "This man's mistress is this woman." I was momentarily stunned by the sudden appearance of Anne and the unfamiliar woman on the bed, but Ted, seizing the moment, shouted at Anne, "What the hell are you doing? Stop spreading lies. Get out." He started throwing whatever he could grab, like pillows and water bottles, at her. Several nurses and I had to restrain Ted, who was glaring at Anne with frustration. "Anne, She was unfazed by the commotion, remained calm, and when I murmured, "That woman over there, she does look a lot like you. From her hairstyle to her figure." "So, Ted's mistress, Annie, is not you?" Anne's face turned beet red, and she snapped, "You didn't think I was that scumbag's mistress, did you?" Tentatively, I apologized, saying, "I'm sorry. I thought it was you." Anne let out a big sigh and said, "Don't be ridiculous. I'm not that bad," looking exasperated. Suddenly quiet, Ted, and the other woman, Annie, were ignored as Anne explained that about 2 months ago, she had accidentally seen Ted and Annie arm in arm, walking through the city at night. Knowing that I was dating Ted, and thought it was an affair but decided to gather solid evidence before telling me. Letting them be for the time being. Indeed, as I had overheard at the restaurant, and found out that Ted and Annie were planning not just an affair but to have me marry Ted. Secretly enjoy a polygamous lifestyle and make me take care of Ted's grandmother. And received a message from me saying, "I've been proposed to. So I guess we're engaged now." This prompted her to rush the secret photo shoot she had arranged with a friend to capture the final piece of evidence of their affair. Amidst this, a friend from the HR department at work informed her that Ted had been injured in an accident during a trip and was hospitalized. Assuming I was the one accompanying him, she rushed over without hesitation. This guy, he had rented a car through the company's employee benefits, so we got the accident report immediately. I tried calling you but couldn't get through, and when I arrived, guess who was hospitalized in the same room? This mistress. I thought if you rushed over worried and found out about this, you would be devastated. Sure enough, I did show up, but something seemed off. Anne was bewildered by my accusation of Ted being unfaithful and even more so by my mistaking her for the mistress. I, in turn, recounted my experiences at Ted's family home and witnessing Annie, the mistress, with Ted's family at the restaurant. Mistaking her for Anne from afar and assuming she was the younger woman Ted's mother mentioned. Though we consider ourselves close friends, Anne is nearly 10 years my junior. And is actually the younger sister of a close friend from my middle and high school days. After her sister's tragic death, Anne and I became even closer. However, I couldn't help but feel there was an unbridgeable gap between us, given our age difference and different careers. After apologizing again, Anne, with a sly smile, said, "Well, if you are fed up with these losers too, there's no need to hold back. Let's give them hell," smirking maliciously at Ted and Annie. Ted and Annie, momentarily taken aback, retorted, "Hell? Don't make me laugh. I only hung out with this old hag because she seemed to have some use. If she wants to break up, I'm all for it." But Anne provocatively asked, "Really now, Teddy? You sure you want to be so confident? What were you two discussing before I sneaked into this room?" Then thrust something she had been holding towards them. Everyone leaned in to see it was a voice recorder in her hand. Anne revealed that at the time of the accident, Annie, not Ted, was driving the rental car, and since she was under a driving suspension, they had declared to the rental company that only Ted would drive. She also recorded them admitting to drunk driving after enjoying their drinks at the inn and deciding to drive out to see the night view despite being intoxicated. As Ted desperately tried to snatch the recorder from Anne, he grimaced in pain and dumped it into a nearby water pitcher. Smirking, "Too bad, all the evidence is gone now." And, unfazed, revealed another, smaller voice recorder and said, "Oh, what a shame." As if I'd show my hand so blatantly. Then showed a pen-type IC recorder in her pocket and a voice recorder app open on her phone, stating, "See, I'm quite competent at my job." Before her expression turned serious, "You've hurt my best friend, and you're going to pay for it," staring down Ted. Stunned, Ted fell silent, but then Annie turned on him. "You idiot. It's all because you and your parents screwed up that our whole plan's ruined. You better take responsibility." Although she tried to confront him, her hand immobilized by a cast and sling, she could only grind her teeth in frustration. Ted, looking up, retorted, "Shut up, you worthless woman. Your only asset is your youth. Misunderstanding that. You dared to dream of becoming my wife. Marrying a loose woman like you would only lead to cuckolding. Who would fall for that?" And with that, he swung his leg in a cast off the bed, nearly lunging at Annie, unleashing a torrent of scolding at her. Both were equally despicable. In a sense, they deserved each other. Expecting the nurses to rush in again to scold them, I stood up with Anne, ready to make our final statement. Enough with the noise. You two are truly meant for each other. A trashy woman who cozies up to an engaged man for some benefit. And a foolish man who thinks he's playing smart but is just being used by a shallow woman. Let me make it clear, I have no sympathy for you. Only contempt, and with that, Anne and I left the room. Behind the closed door, we could hear Ted calling out and Annie's screams, but we ignored them and walked away. Later, before leaving the town, we visited the stores and inns damaged by Ted and Annie's rental car. Initially met with disdain as relatives of the irresponsible driver, the mood changed once we explained the situation, turning into sympathy for us. At that point, we advised the owner of the catering business, which had suffered significant damage, it may come out in the police investigation. But the driver who crashed into your establishment was likely under the influence and driving with a suspended license. You might not be able to claim insurance, and worse, you might end up not receiving any compensation and instead get stiffed. After that, we promised to immediately send a copy of the recording made in the hospital room, which contained Ted and Annie admitting to drunk driving and their attempts to pin it on me. Moreover, Anne suggested that while Ted's whereabouts might be easier to ascertain, tracking Annie, who was still on probation at the company, could prove difficult given the current emphasis on privacy protection. She advised taking action sooner rather than later and then emphasized, "Please keep the source of this information confidential." She then shared what she knew about Annie, including her rough home address, the apartment where she currently lives, and the fact that she was likely hired through a referral by the executive vice president, who was probably her guarantor. The sudden intrusion of a reckless driver wreaked havoc on the beloved shop, and although the owner repeatedly thanked us, they rightfully had claims against those two. If the exercise of those rights brought Ted and Annie their just desserts, it would be a delightfully satisfying turn of events for us, making us the ones who should be expressing gratitude. Triumphant in our journey back with Anne, we learned that the two left in the hospital were promptly advised to transfer due to their poor behavior, effectively being expelled. Ted's parents rushed over upon hearing the news, only to be faced with demands from the hospital for the costs of the damaged equipment, hospitalization, and surgery fees caused by their children. Their available cash fell short, and even after selling bags, watches, and jewelry at nearby pawn shops, it barely made a dent in the expenses. In the end, they had to secure a loan against their sedan from a lender known for its ruthless terms, essentially signing over the car's ownership soon as the grateful shop owner informed us over a thank you call. Moreover, the accident, thankfully not involving others, was a solo crash. However, possibly to conceal Annie's drunk driving and suspended license, they hadn't reported the incident to the police, making it impossible to obtain an accident report. Regardless, the revelation of drunk driving and a suspended license would mean their personal injuries, let alone the insurance for the totaled rental car itself, and any property damage would be utterly unusable. The thought of them facing a looming debt hell, just waiting for them, brought an uncontrollable smile to our faces. I decided to proceed swiftly with the next steps, starting by reporting to the police, along with the recorded evidence, that Annie, Ted's mistress, had been drinking and driving a rental car. The police contacted the rental car company to verify the facts, and soon the company's lawyer rushed over. After returning from the hospital, I handed over printed screenshots of the numerous SNS messages sent by Ted and Annie trying to silence me, along with the recorded conversation from the hospital room. The company's lawyer, with a big smile, said, "Thank you for your cooperation in every aspect. This will allow us to proceed with the damage claims swiftly," and left seemingly in high spirits. According to a letter that came with a luxurious box of sweets sent to me jointly by the rental car company and the legal advisor's office, the rental car company, based on the evidence I provided, notified Ted and Annie that they were filing a lawsuit for damages against them for the accident involving the rental car they had rented, which was nearly in new condition and was totaled. At the same time, a report was filed with the police, putting Ted and Annie in a tight spot. Despite hastily hiring a lawyer, they were bluntly told they had no chance in court and managed to settle by paying the amount requested by the rental car company. However, this lump sum payment made it difficult for Ted to keep up with his luxury condo payments, forcing him to sell. Regardless of how short the time lived there was, a used property is still used. In the end, Ted only managed to get about half of his asking price, and even dedicating all of it to his mortgage debt. He was far from paying it off, leaving him with significant debt. Additionally, the catering store that Annie crashed into while driving the rental car claimed about $350,000 for the destroyed store. Repair costs for dishes and kitchen equipment, the cost of ingredients bought for a long weekend. Compensation and apology costs to customers with reservations, lost earnings due to the repair period overlapping with the holiday season. And the cost of a wrecked delivery minivan, among other expenses. Heeding my and Anne's advice, the store demanded a lump sum payment from both. They were told that legal action would be taken immediately if they didn't comply. The store's compensation should have been covered by voluntary insurance as property damage. But Ted and Annie hadn't opted for the insurance when renting the car, and the coverage limit for property damage was only $200,000. Furthermore, the accident caused by Annie, who was driving without a license due to suspension and under the influence. Without having declared herself as a driver to the rental company, and without obtaining an accident certificate at that time, led the insurance company to deny coverage, as we had predicted. Ultimately, Ted and Annie had to pay out of their own pockets. Then, a terrible argument erupted between Ted and Annie, blaming each other for the situation. "I should never have dated a jinx like you. That's my line. You were all drooling over a younger woman. And to think you can't even cough up this amount of money, what a miserly old man." After hurling insults at each other, Ted and Annie, who once vowed eternal love, found themselves embroiled in a chaotic situation, suing each other for defamation, insult, and damages. Given the messy nature of the situation, a resolution was hard to come by. Despite already taking time off work due to injuries from the accident, Ted's frequent absences due to court appearances led his exasperated company to transfer him to a department known colloquially as exile. Ted's pride as a self-proclaimed elite was shattered, but due to the various payments involved in this ordeal, he was unable to resign. On the other hand, Anne was more furious than anyone about Annie's affairs with not only Ted but also several other male colleagues during her probation period. Exposed her. Some of them were married, and due to disrupting company discipline and potentially affecting work, Annie, despite being hired through connections, was promptly fired without being officially hired. If Annie has to pay for the damages to the catering store, the debt she incurs at 23 will be enormous. Facing financial difficulties, Annie hastily started job hunting, but when asked to submit a proof of dismissal from her previous job, her prospects dimmed, leading her to give up on securing a full-time position. Now, she is juggling part-time jobs to make ends meet and has been seen, unkempt and in casual attire, eating bread while rushing to a warehouse district on her bike, a sight relayed to me through the grapevine. However, this has nothing to do with me. As for me, despite being busy with demanding work, I am leading a fulfilling life. I'm also happy that I've been able to reconnect and get along with my best friend and, just like old times, after a period of misunderstandings and awkwardness. The only issue, if any, is Anne's unchanging nature. She keeps inviting me to mixers, saying, "Sophie, want to join a mixer? It's hosted by that temp we had before. Divorced, but with nice personalities only." I have a good feeling about this one. It's not that I've been put off by my experience with Ted, but I've recently rediscovered the joys of being single and am looking for a way to gently dissuade Anne from these invitations. A dilemma I'm currently pondering.